Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm just doing a wrap-up of the books that I read over September. This is going to be split mostly into two parts, partly because I actually did somehow manage to read quite a few books this month. I don't know where that time happened actually, I'm really quite confused about that. But also because a large number of the books I read this month were advance copies, and so I thought it made sense to keep a lot of the ones, particularly the ones that haven't come out yet, all in one place. So there'll be a few advance copies that make their way into this but are now out, if that makes sense. I should stop talking about that. Let's get going. So this month I read quite a few books, and I started off, you'll notice as well, quite a lot of them are short, which is how they all fit in. But the first book I read was a book for my local bookshop's book club. Said book a lot in that sentence, but that book was The Weekend by Charlotte Wood, and so this book is sort of focused around four older women who are sort of a group of friends, a little bit like Sex and the City, but you know, not in many ways, as you see when I sort of talk about this. So The Weekend focuses on a weekend that these women have, and basically one of the sort of central women has died, and so the other three women come together to sort of mourn her and kind of clear out her house and sort a few things. But it brings to the surface lots of problems that have been boiling and bubbling up in their friendship for a while. So a few of these friends haven't really spoken in a while, and when they do, you know, one of them's having financial issues, one of them is sort of a faded, like, former star who's sort of not quite sure how she's going to get her next acting job, and there's a dog that is sick and kind of old and whatever. It's a quite a weird, bonkers little story, but really beautifully written. I was really quite impressed by how this novel was put together. I thought it was really funny, really clever. It captured a lot of kind of characters' voices really, really well, and this sort of odd thing that happens with, you know, women who have been friends for so long that it seems on the surface that they hate each other. And actually this was something that came up a lot in the book club itself, people kind of being like, do these women even like each other? All of that kind of, yeah. But I thought it was really, really fun, really, really clever, and a good fun read. I mean, it looks longer than it is actually. It's only about 250 pages or so. It's quite a nice quick read, so yes, I would highly recommend this one. Next up, I read Dragman by Stephen Appleby, and this is a graphic novel. I wasn't expecting to enjoy this nearly as much as I did. Essentially, it is kind of, as the name sort of suggests, there is a character who realizes once they start wearing sort of quote unquote women's clothing, they kind of, that's their superpower, and they suddenly become basically like, you know, any other sort of regular flying superhero character. And I wasn't expecting to be charmed by this book quite the way I was. It's really quite funny and silly, but also really deals with a lot of important issues. So early on, we're meant to sort of see this character as being drag, you know, kind of a drag queen of some sort. But then actually, you know, as the name suggests, like Dragman, but actually this character reveals a lot more as we're going, that actually maybe they identify somewhere sort of on a kind of trans spectrum, like they identify with being trans in some way, and they find it difficult to really pinpoint that in various points of the book. And again, you know, it's a sort of superhero story, and there's obviously a kind of formulaic plot aspect to that was actually really enjoyable in this. I just thought it was so silly and funny in parts, but actually really genuinely touching, as we see this character really have to navigate what it's like to, for example, sort of be found out, or kind of keep this as sort of secret from their partner, their wife in this case, or girlfriend, I think, who is just sort of at first really shocked by this, is sort of really upset by the idea that this has been kept a secret, and actually just sort of navigates it really beautifully, really warmly. It's such a human story, and I really loved this, and I just thought it was really, really clever. Next up was Soul Tourists by Bernardine Evaristo. So I listened to this as an audiobook. Bernardine Evaristo, obviously better known for Girl, Woman, Other. And so I'm kind of enjoying every so often going back and listening to other books of hers, but not sort of mostly as audiobooks, but you know, a couple sort of physically reading as well. And Bernardine Evaristo, it's so interesting to see actually all of the books that she wrote leading up to Girl, Woman, Other, because that kind of trademark style of hers, I think, in there, that very kind of British sort of sarcastic sense of humor is in there. And Soul Tourists deals with this idea of this couple, sort of at the heart of it, who are navigating their relationship whilst on a tour of Europe. And on this tour of Europe, they are kind of basically really connecting with a lot of the kind of thinkers and characters and sort of people from history of colour who have sort of been either left out or kind of, you know, aren't necessarily always recognised in the same way. And it reminded me a little bit, because of that, of Afropean by Johnny Pitts. So that is a non-fiction book where Johnny Pitts does a tour of Europe, particularly going to sort of finding kind of either diaspora communities or kind of black communities in sort of various European towns and cities, and kind of understanding their experience of being in kind of in kind of European countries and sort of being seen as others. So I thought Soul Tourists by Bernardine and Evaristo was really clever and kind of captured a lot of that similar thing of this sort of little thing. It's very funny and very, very fun little book. Yeah, the next two are arcs, but they're actually out now, so I feel like I can put them in this. The first is Missing Words by Laurie Westron. And this book, as part of a Fairlight Modern series, is a really interesting little book. It's, I think, probably only about 150 pages long or thereabouts. And I thought it was just a really interesting book. It looks at the idea of one woman who wants to track down a missing letter. So she works in a post office, sort of sorting office, and she sees a love letter that has been written to to somebody, but can't seemingly place where this is meant to have been delivered to. And I just thought it was really interesting because this woman is having her own issues at home with her relationship. Her husband is sort of works in sort of mining, and sort of coal mining, and this is around the time of the Thatcher era, so a lot of mines are being shut. So he is having this sort of crisis of feeling like less of a man and feeling sort of disempowered by everything, and meanwhile her career is taking off to some degree, and so she is navigating, really trying to hold the family together, hold on to this job that she is very much told that she's lucky to have, particularly being a woman, that, you know, it should, you know, almost, you can hear almost these men around her trying to take this job from her, and in the meantime she's trying to track down this relationship and make sure that this letter gets delivered to this person. I just thought it was a really interesting little book, as was another book from that same Fairlight Moderns series, which is Only About Love by Debbi Voicy. And this book I thought was actually, I just thought was so beautiful. I found it really actually quite profound and quite moving. It's a book that talks about a family sort of dealing with sort of dementia and Alzheimer's, and it at first it seems like it's going to be a very different book to what it is. It's again sort of novella length, very, very short chapters, sometimes, you know, paragraph or a page long, and it starts in a kind of stream of consciousness chapter, and the rest of the book is not actually like that, but it's a really interesting setup where we slowly watch and basically trace the family history of this whole family through watching this man kind of excel in his life and sort of the family that he's built, and then watch his decline as he starts losing his memory. And it's really quite profound and quite beautiful. There's a really gorgeous scene, it's heartbreaking but really beautifully written, about watching a parent, you know, or an older person become infantilized by their illness or by the things that they can't do. And so, you know, suddenly this dad is sort of almost like a child, you know, you know, his children are looking after him, and trying to give him the kind of dignity and respect that he sort of should have. But yeah, it's really tricky. It's a heartbreaking little book, and again, in 150 pages, this book does a lot. But I just thought it was beautiful, and just such an interesting book. Yeah, so again, this was an arc. I think quite a lot of these were arcs. I think I basically got too trigger happy on NetGalley, signed up for far too many, and I've been sort of working through them this month. So there we go. And the next one is also an arc. It is Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead. So sort of background, I guess, in the sense that Colson Whitehead, I have had mixed results with. Really enjoyed the Underground Railroad. I thought that was really, really powerful and really well written. Nickel Boys I did enjoy, but something about it left me a tiny bit cold, and I think it's really weird. I was invested in the story and really liked the story. There was something about the writing that just didn't gel with me. Not entirely sure what it was. And then Harlem Shuffle, I found that the sort of the same thing happened to me again, where bits of the story I thought were really powerful. So it's sort of set in Harlem, as the name suggests, and it's sort of trying to capture a very specific time in history, this kind of sort of 30s and around. Like there's a sort of a heist that's being planned, but what from I didn't necessarily enjoy the heist scenes. I found it a bit too, I don't know, it didn't really work for me. That's not also a kind of book I read that often anyway, so maybe that was also part of the thing. But there are some scenes of protest later in the book, and I thought they were written about so cleverly and so like insightfully, that I really, really enjoyed it. I just think for me it was just a bit of a book of sort of two sides in that way. I also buddy read this with Larry over at Larry Has Opinions, who did a video on this separately that basically expresses all of my opinions way better than I could have put it. So do give that a look in. I think Larry describes it really, really well. And I just thought, yeah, such an interesting premise for an idea, and some bits I really enjoyed, but just overall left me a bit cold. But also I'm fully aware that it's maybe just the type of genre or the type of thing that maybe isn't exactly my bag, so who knows. Next up, I read something a little bit different, which is couch fiction. Oh, you can't really see because of the light. There we go. A graphic tale of psychotherapy. And so essentially this is, as the name suggests, a graphic novel. So kind of all these sort of really brilliant kind of designs. And it takes you through a fictionalized, but very much based on real cases from this woman, Philippa Perry, who is a psychotherapist, and she she has had quite a lot of clients, and so she creates this sort of fictional client based on a lot of the people she's met before and worked with, and she basically guides you through the whole process. And it's really interesting because you start off by basically meeting the client at the same time she does, and we always get her inner thoughts as well. So a little aside about, oh, actually I shouldn't have said that, or a kind of, it's written as well almost as if you are sort of someone trying to learn about what psychotherapy is. So she will say, for example, you may notice that I said this at this point. This is to try and elicit more details, all of those kinds of things. So really interesting. I got it for my birthday a bit ago, and I was really keen to check it out. And it was basically one of those days where I'd had a bit of a brain melt and I wanted to read something, but I needed something not too intensive, which, reading something on psychotherapy, that's nice and chilled. But no, the fact is a graphic novel made the whole thing a lot easier, and it's so well done to kind of take you through that whole process. So I thought a really, really fun little addition here. And then this is where some of the other ones get a little bit darker. Whoa, this is fun. So I next read Sarah Moss's Night Waking, and so this book is dark and not an easy read. It concerns sort of two women at different points in history. So one woman in the modern day who is really struggling with lack of sleep, because her kid is keeping her awake at night and she's barely slept, and her husband is not helping that much around the house or with the kids. So she feels like she's doing it all alone, which reminded me a lot of The Mental Load by the kind of graphic novel by Emma, which I think does this really, really well, and kind of captures that idea of the responsibility always being placed on, well, not always, but very often being placed on women in opposite sex or different sex relationships, and what that often means is that women sort of take the load of having to kind of do everything around the house. So this woman is sort of at breaking point, and we see a moment where she almost hits her child, where she really like loses her temper and is really struggling. And this is balanced with a woman's life sort of about 100 or so years before, who basically this isn't a spoiler because it happens really early on. Essentially a baby's body is found, like a skeleton of a baby is found in the modern day woman's garden, and this prompts the modern day woman to look back and try and find out more about this this older woman's life from like 100 years ago. And we learn a lot about the moments that led up to this happening. So yeah, and what was what was really particularly grueling about this as well on a personal level is I was reading this around the time that I sort of been having quite a few thoughts on whether I wanted kids in future, and I was like, oh, you know, I'm sort of in my early 30s. This is something I've sort of been thinking about. I'm like, yes, I think I do want kids. And then I was reading this book, like this crikey, as this woman is just like, yes, I've barely slept and I'm angry and I'm lashing out and I can't control anything anymore. And I was like, great. So thanks, Sarah Moss. And I'll talk about it in the other video as well. But around the same time, I also read Sarah Moss's newest novel, The Fell, which comes out in November. So I'll talk about it in the other video, but it was fun to have sort of pretty much back-to-back Sarah Moss, even if that's not the easiest thing to read. I was like, oh gosh, Sarah Moss is great. Like, I adore her writing. I just think she's such a fantastic writer, but my goodness, does she love a good, like, macabre, like, dark storyline. So yeah, that was fun. Love, that's you know, that was a fun way to spend the last days of summer. But anyway, I digress. Yeah, Night Waking by Sarah Moss. I still think it's really worth checking out. Not the easiest read to stomach, so please be warned in that sense. Next up, I did a separate video on this, Colm Toibin's The Magician. So this book I just thought was absolutely gorgeous. Again, read an advance copy, but thank you NetGalley, sponsoring half of this month, essentially. And yeah, Colm Toibin's The Magician is a sort of historical novel focusing on Thomas Mann and his life. Thomas Mann, the German writer, who I hadn't realised was, I mean, it's difficult to put sort of modern day labels on sort of previous people, but essentially lived his life as sort of some kind of like, well, he was a man who had sex with men, and had a lot of attractions to men. And what's really interesting about this book that I think makes it just such a brilliant read is it's just so profoundly moving and in-depth, and you get the feeling that Toibin has an idea of every single detail in every room, even though he couldn't obviously have been there. And I just think it's beautiful. I just think this is such a stunning book. I was so moved by it. I was sort of reading the final pages almost in tears. So many moments kind of choked me up, actually. It's really beautiful. And I think I said in my individual video about it, there's something so special about a gay writer, Colm Toibin, writing about another sort of potentially gay or kind of queer writer in Thomas Mann. And there's a real insight into the shame and the yearning that he might be feeling, and I just think it's great. And then sort of similarly following on from that, I read Thomas Mann's novel A Death in Venice, which is covered quite in a bit of detail in some ways in The Magician by Toibin, of a man who essentially is watching this sort of young, like an older man watching this young man on the shore in this sort of in Venice, and is sort of seems to have this kind of attraction to him, and there's this, again, that kind of queer yearning comes up in a really interesting way. And what's interesting, again, that Toibin has pointed out in a few interviews, is that Katia, Thomas Mann's wife, knew that this is going on. She remembers this moment on holiday where Thomas Mann was eyeing up this man and kept on, you know, this sort of kept on looking over at him, sort of quite yearningly, if that's a word. And you know, Toibin is really interesting for saying, actually, this woman Katia is so much more clever, is so much cleverer. The irony, so much more clever, is so much cleverer than Thomas Mann gives her credit for. She sees basically that she knows that he is attracted to men, but she kind of still kind of carries on her life and kind of just quietly watches from the sidelines. So yeah, really interesting. Next up, with more books where people die, is Heatwave by Victor Jestin. And this book, as you may guess from the author's name, it was originally in French and has been translated. It's a very, very slim book. It's about 100 pages or so. and it details a summer during a heat wave, as the name suggests, where these two men, well, the sort of two young boys really, are on the beach, and basically one of them dies, and we get this moment of this other one trying to navigate what it's like to be in a very sort of bottlenecked, trapped kind of environment that is a holiday resort in kind of a slightly remote place during a heat wave. So nobody's really going far, everyone's kind of lazing around, but everyone's a bit irritable because of the heat. But in the meantime, he's sort of almost trying to cover up a death. And I just thought this was really cleverly done, very pacey, very tense. It is a bit of a thriller almost in some ways, but so brilliantly handled, and just really, I mean, fun seems like the wrong word to use for like, and someone died on holiday, but it's really, it's well handled, and it's really visceral. The way that we feel this kind of gut punch of a secret following this young boy around is really quite heartbreaking. So I really enjoyed it. Doesn't sound like it's that enjoyable. And another one that I did a separate video on, Sally Rooney with Beautiful World, Where Are You? And I really enjoyed this, much more than I was expecting to. I read Normal People, I kind of enjoyed it. But it didn't hit home in the way that it seems to have done for so many other people. And I think that's the really interesting thing with Sally Rooney's writing. For some people, her books sort of take on this really big life of people just being like, this speaks to me in a way that nothing has ever really spoken to me before. And that's incredible. I love that. And I'm just really keen to see what it looks like for other people. But for me, Beautiful World, Where Are You? I suddenly started to get a bit of the love for Sally Rooney. I was like, this is actually brilliantly done. It deals with, I've done a separate video, so do check out that for all of my thoughts. But I think what it handles a lot better for me than something like Normal People is it really engages with a wider world. So it uses the relationships at the heart of this novel to really explore some big issues politically, and particularly in a very 2020, 2021 kind of way. So yeah, I think really well done. If a bit, some really powerful gut punch moments as well there. So I think it's a great book. Yeah. And then Quelle Surprise. I read some Booker Prize books, this time just to get them back to the library because I have been holding on to them for way too long, and the library, I think I'd reached the upper limit of how long I could hold this book, so it needed to go back. So the first was The Chant of Jimmie Blacksmith by Thomas Keneally. Thomas Keneally, no stranger to the Booker Prize, I think shortlisted 4 or 5 times, one with Schindler's Ark, or kind of had a different name at the time. But yes, this book I didn't necessarily always get along with, but it follows an Aboriginal man in Australia, but his sort of family history is quite complicated in that I think he has I believe it's a white mother. I want to say it's that way around, and as a result, he's this sort of character who keeps on getting into trouble, and he's sort of kind of caught in a way that many people of sort of mixed heritage often find quite tricky, where sort of both sides of their identity sort of seem to clash. So for white people, he's not white enough. For some Aboriginal people, he's not Aboriginal enough. And we basically chart this really quite difficult life of this man, and it apparently is based on a sort of real story, on a true story. But we follow this man as he's basically just sort of shunted between people, and he has quite a rough upbringing. It's a difficult book to read at times. It's it can be quite violent, it's quite brutal, but I still think is quite a powerful book. I don't know if it's necessarily it's I think it's still very still a decent book, but I think it's yeah, I don't know, I couldn't fully fall in love with it in the way that I maybe have with other books that have been a bit more political. In some ways it reminded me a little bit of, couldn't remember the name, there we go. So in some ways it reminded me of Peter Carey's The True History of the Kelly Gang, in that it feels very similar actually in some ways to me, sort of following this man in Australia who's kind of a bit of an outlaw, or a bit of a kind of difficult figure who's kind of hated by various sort of police forces, and has a bit of a bad reputation publicly. But also for some reason something didn't connect for both books with me, where I appreciate that they're both well written, but I can't fully fall in love with them, and I don't really know why. So yeah, that's very much where this book falls for me, but still, you know, I think worth reading. And you know, I'm sort of slowly working my way through some of the early 1970s Booker Prize shortlists, so those will be coming soon. But this was one of them, sort of shortlisted in 1972, and yeah, I can kind of see why. I just don't know if it's necessarily my favourite, but we'll see. Not all of them can be. Next, to keep up this nice cheery theme that we've got going here, I read Akwaeke Emezi's The Death of Vivek Oji, and my goodness, this book is, I mean, I know I've said gut punch like about 1,000,000 times today. This book is like, I feel like is in the dictionary under the definition of gut punch. This, it's just like, it never really lets up. So we basically follow this kind of, obviously we know from the title and the beginning of the book that Vivek Oji has died, and we learn a lot of the backstory as to how he died, and sort of what led up to it. And it's such a beautifully done book. I mean, it's bloody hard to read at times. I listen to it as an audiobook, and sometimes I was sort of just walking being like, crikey. I mean, because it's an emotional, it puts you through the ringer. It really does. It really focuses in on this man and his kind of how his sort of sexuality and the way he presents his gender really mark him out. And this is sort of all set around, you know, how people view their religion and spirituality in regards to his gender and sexuality. We get these, there are scenes in this book that almost felt like performance poetry. It was, you know, almost like slam poetry style, just this rapid fire, interwoven lyrical language that was so well done, and just so sort of pacey and brilliant. And then it'll go back to other parts that feel more traditionally novel-like, and then it'll have these sort of poetic bits again. I thought this novel was incredible. This is extraordinary, and this was a book that I mentioned in a recent video that a few people had spoken about really powerfully, and I really had to check it out after they said it. So one of them being Jennifer Loves Books, and the other being Daniel over at Guilty Feet. I think they both speak about this book so beautifully, and I'm really glad that I checked this book out, even if it's not the easiest to read. But yeah, really well done, and just a stunning piece of literature. And another super cheery book that I followed it up with was Shadows on Our Skin by Jennifer Johnston. And what's so cheery about this, it's set during the Troubles in Ireland. Yay! My goodness. I mean, I know that obviously not all fiction is going to be like full of light, cheery topics. Often, like, you know, you want a dense, difficult topic at the heart of it to wrangle with. And I do love books like that. But it's only now, looking at it in retrospect, that I realise just how many of these books were just really sad and really dreary. That said, Shadows on Our Skin deals with this young boy watching as his sort of parents navigate the Troubles in Ireland, and it's Northern Ireland, and it's really beautifully done. It's very lyrical. Again, this young boy is he is a poet, and so he keeps on, or wants to be a poet, and so he keeps on bringing in his poetry into it. But we slowly watch how everyone in his life is so heavily impacted by the political situation around them, including this young boy who is, for all intents and purposes, trying to stay fairly innocent and happy and joyous in amongst it, and write his little poems and everything. But in the meantime, you know, family members are kind of moving here, there and everywhere. There's a lack of employment. It's really difficult and tense, and I just thought this was really stunning. This was shortlisted for another Booker Prize in the 70s that I've forgotten off the top of my head, I think 77, and another one that I just needed to get back to the library. It's a really short book, and it's really well handled, I think. Her ability, Jennifer Johnston's ability to capture this feel of this time is just really powerful, and particularly, you know, it's always useful and really good in a book like this to have a character who sits apart from everything, you know, this young innocent boy, and it's heartbreaking to watch how he slowly realizes the world that's around him. So yeah, really, really beautiful book. And around the time that I was reading Jennifer Johnston's book Shadows on Our Skin, I was also reading Three Dreams in the Key of G by Marc Nash. And so beating around the books, and I have done a separate video on this where we talk about it at length, because it's a book that is a very experimental book that takes, I think, as a result, you want to have quite a lot of discussion about. And what was interesting as well is around the same time I was reading Jennifer Johnston, I was reading bits of this on the buddy read with Beating Around the Books. And this also has at one point a character who is an Irish, Northern Irishman during the time of the Troubles, who is therefore unemployed and sort of only, sort of is caught in this really weird point and doesn't really understand what it means to be a man and to be part of a family as part of that. So that was a nice little parallel. We talk about it a lot more in depth in the video, but yeah, it was really nice to read a book as well by a booktuber in Marc Nash, who is wonderful and you should all check out anyway. But it was a really fun thing to read this and get a sense of his thoughts and what had kind of led into it essentially. So yeah, really, really interesting book to go alongside that. Another buddy read around the same time, because I'm a glutton for punishment and I've also just signed myself up for about 20 more buddy reads next year. Bring it on. I'm going to read nothing by myself next year, it seems, at this rate. And that buddy read with a few people, a few wonderful booktubers and a kind of bookstagrammers and a few other people, was Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. And again, Larry has a video. Does Larry have a video for this? He probably does, for almost everything. But yes, The Name of the Rose. And so this is a book that I was really surprised by what it actually was when I started reading. Granted, I was the worst buddy read partner in the sense that everyone was on about page 400 and I was like, so I've read the first chapter, or the first like little bit that's 10 pages long, and then very rapidly caught up because I had to. And it is a book that follows a group of sort of monks, and sort of it's set around a kind of sort of monastery or that kind of environment. And there are a series of deaths, and it's kind of almost a bit of a murder mystery alongside a lot of detail around mythology and sort of religious tales and religious sort of ecclesiastical stuff. I don't really have the vocabulary for it. That was not a very good description. And in the midst of all of that, we're trying to work out these murders. And what I thought was really clever and fun about it in this book is there are just some really almost sort of, it feels very postmodern in a lot of ways. I think it has been described as a postmodern novel before, in a way that really reminded me of Don Quixote. And I realise that sounds like a really pretentious thing to say, but Don Quixote has that same kind of feeling for me of, these two characters against the world, and they're kind of, we're shown all of their quirks and their foibles, but at the same time, it's kind of a very self-referential book. So, the reader is very much involved in this book. A lot of the time it will be sort of like, well, I don't need to tell you that this thing happened next. And so it's really interesting because it's written very much in the style of an older book, of the time of Don Quixote or of the time of something like Dickens, with, chapters where at the top of the chapter, it'll give you the summary of what's about to happen in the chapter. So yeah, really interesting. I'm glad I read it. It's quite, it's a really silly and funny book. Perhaps there was too much, there's too much of attention in the book for me of time being spent on sort of long passages talking about theology and long passages around the murder mystery aspect, and I kind of wanted it to pick a lane, although I do see how them weaving in together was good and clever. But yeah, but I still overall really enjoyed this, and I thought it was a really fun book to read. So I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've also read it, and I also do urge you to check out Larry's video because he does a much better job of describing it than I just did there. There we go. And the last few books before I went massively into ARC territory this month were Ocean Vuong's Night Sky with Exit Wounds, which is a poetry collection that really goes into just this really stunning, so I really enjoyed On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. I thought that was stunning. I think I enjoyed this even more. I thought this really handled this sort of, I don't often read poetry, but when I do, I really love people like Ocean Vuong. The way he captures this really sensuous, beautiful, loving, warm language and juxtaposes it with this real violence and coldness, and there's an aggression that comes out in some of the words and word choices, and it's so startling. Like, this book looks at relationships between family members and sort of relationships with heritage and sort of romantic relationships, and it's gorgeous. I love this, and I really need to read more Ocean Fawn, because I think there's something about the way he writes that just really cuts through to me, and I just think it's just beautiful. So I'd really urge you to check that out. The next one, and this is for a video that I've got coming up this month, hopefully, looking at some other books by Booker shortlisted authors from this year, and that is Maggie Shipstead, so on the Booker shortlist for Great Circle, but this time with Astonish Me. And this is a story all about, I always think that I'm about to go into the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air theme tune every time I start doing that. This is a story all about ballet, very different. And it's essentially this it's a sort of multi-generational story, so we kind of get little flashbacks in time, but essentially a ballerino, is that the male ballerina? A ballet man who is who moves from Russia to the US sort of during Cold War times and sort of during all of that, and sort of is sort of therefore kind of almost excommunicated from Russia. But anyway, his sort of relationship with this woman, and then the children, then kind of in a sort of more modern day bit, kind of asking a lot of questions around this. And I thought this book was really beautifully done in capturing the artistry of something like ballet, and the kind of the discipline and the work that goes into it, which I find really fascinating and kind of terrifying. But what I thought this book did really well is capture that kind of tension for what it can be like to be an implant in a new country, if that makes sense. So someone who's moved to a new country, not necessarily by his choice. You know, he's kind of done this to escape tough conditions in Russia, and sort of still thinks about his homeland, but is sort of involved in all of these things. And I think the phrase at the heart of, the title of this book, Astonish Me, comes from a French phrase that is used by sort of this artistic director in ballet, kind of saying like, étonnez-moi, like, just like stun me, surprise me, I want to see something special. And I thought this book handled it really well, and is really interesting. I think I still prefer Great Circle by her. I think that feels like a slightly more like developed work compared to this, but I still think this is a really interesting book, a really well handled novel, and it's clear that Maggie Shipstead can write, because there are some beautiful sentences in this book, and I enjoyed it a lot. And then the final few as we're coming through. So the next was Forced Out by Kevin Maxwell. This is a really sort of bizarre sort of set of books all at the same time. This is what happens when you reserve lots of things from the library. Kevin Maxwell's Forced Out. So this is a book about this, a non-fiction book about Kevin Maxwell, who was a black and gay police officer in the UK. And essentially, during his policing career, he faced a lot of sort of both racist and homophobic, either abuse or kind of discrimination, or a mixture of everything during his time. And so sometimes that would just be sort of comments here and there. Sometimes it was the institutional culture of the UK police. And it's really interesting because, you can tell that he was a police officer in this book by just the writing. It's very precise, it's very report written, it's very kind of like he's sort of taking notes and kind of detailing. But as the book goes on, we realize that he basically he was an exemplary police officer, and when he started to call out some of the institutional biases or the discrimination that he faced in the police force, including being looked over for promotions, including not being given the support he needed, he was met with a lot of backlash, and the more he tried to fight it, the further out he was pushed. And the title Forced Out has obviously a bit of a feeling of that as well, that he feels very much that he was forced out of the police force because he did not sort of just grin and take it when he was sort of subject to so much sort of abuse and discrimination and being looked over. And so the later half of this book, really, about halfway in, we start the court case aspect of this book, and all of the sort of tribunals and everything that he went through, and we see how this man is sort of broken down. His mental health and physical health and relationships all really struggle because he basically starts you know, he's fighting constantly, he's facing a lot of stress, and he talks about the extra mental load of being a black gay man in what is often a straight white male sort of police force, and how he's therefore sort of constantly fighting or hiding bits of himself every day. This book is on the Polari Prize shortlist, which I'll be doing something separately on in October at some point, which is an LGBT book prize, and I'm really keen to talk a bit more about some of the other shortlisted books once I've read some of them. But yeah, I just think this is a really interesting book, and you just really feel for this man who has just been put through absolute hell in the pursuit of justice and of truth. And yeah, it's a difficult read, but a really useful and essential one, I think. And the final two books before the arcs that I'm going to be talking about in a separate video that I finished reading this month were, another one was from this Polari Prize shortlist, and this was The Intoxicating Mr Lavelle. And this book is really interesting, I think. So this is by Neil Blackmore. This is a book sort of set in the sort of 1700s, of sort of these foppish kind of larger than life characters, but navigating their sexuality and their relationships in that time. And on the surface, that sounds like it could be quite cheesy and kind of cliched. I think this book is handled really well. The author, like Neil Blackmore, really gets into the heart of what it is to feel shame and to feel yearning as a queer person. And it's so heartbreaking watching this man navigate aspects of his identity in a world that is very unforgiving, but whilst also being so camp and theatrical, like this world of these sort of giant high wigs, and as you can see on the front of the front cover of the book, these sort of ridiculous sort of, you know, sort of pompous kind of costumes, but actually at the heart of it, this is all a Machiavellian game of sort of social politics, of anything you can do to destroy people around you, you do it. And so his sexuality becomes a kind of curse almost in that thing, or it becomes something that can be used against him. Equally, I'm caught in the sun. Equally, he is, we find out that he has Jewish roots of some form, and this becomes a real family, a sort of a secret that's full of shame in this family, because although they're mostly fine with the idea of being Jewish, it is not okay to be Jewish for those people in that time. You know, sort of Britain's anti-Semitism is sort of quite rife, we're told, in sort of various parts. And so this man is sort of trying to navigate all of this, and also navigate this really larger than life character in Mr Lavelle, who is this sort of foppish, kind of cad kind of character, and it's really interesting. I was really quite moved by this book in sort of several ways, and I wasn't expecting to. And yeah, it's really beautifully done. And that leads me to the final book that I read this month, and I'm really caught in the sun now. There we go, I'm going to step really back whilst balancing and hoping not to fall off this stool. And the final book I read this month was Afterparties, and this is a short story collection by an author who's unfortunately no longer with us, Anthony Veasna So, a Cambodian writer who, this is his first collection of short stories, and he died before it actually even came out, so we didn't even really get much more. So, you know, real shame that to lose someone so young, and particularly someone of such talent. So I heard about this book through Eric Carl Anderson over at Linton Reader, and this is a short story collection that really deals with Cambodian identity and queer identity, and how those two things intersect with each other and intersect with the US. And you know, Cambodia's history in the last, you know, sort of in the 80s, particularly kind of around the kind of Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot kind of era, is heartbreaking. It's a time of history that is so cruel. It feels, reading about it or hearing anything about it feels almost so unreal. It feels heartbreaking to think that this could be a real thing. But yeah, and I've been to the killing fields that are referenced a little bit in this, and it's, I mean, that experience broke me, because you're sort of just hearing these stories of something that happened about 40 years ago, Yeah, it's a lot. But this short story collection is really witty and really funny, but really packs a punch. So it engages with some of these issues around what it must be like to be part of a kind of Cambodian diaspora in the US, and sort of navigating, trying to be really proud of a Khmer or Cambodian identity, whilst also trying to grapple with what's happened in recent living memory and history in the country. And then also there's a real question throughout a lot of these short stories for the main, for our sort of narrator, about whether he's queer enough, whether he's Cambodian enough for some people. And it's really interestingly handled. And I was really very impressed by this collection. His writing is so funny and irreverent and powerful. And I just thought this was, it's such a good book. But yeah, apart from the arcs that I'm going to be talking about in a separate video, those are the books that I read in September. I'd love to hear about some of the books you read, if you've read any of these as well. And yeah, apart from that, I hope you've had a good reading month. I hope you're looking forward to your reading in October, and I'll speak to you all soon when I'm hopefully not completely caught in sun. I've been Bob the Bookerer. Take care, and I hope you have a great reading month. Bye bye.